On the Recyard, Women's Prison Podcast, where we are live on the Recyard every Wednesday night. Hey, everyone. It is Wednesday night, and we are live on the Recyard Women's Prison Podcast. I'm Marci Marie.
I'm Toonchi.
We have a special guest.
Yeah, you brought somebody to rec with you tonight.
I did. Don't get jealous. Now, you know how besties do on the Recyard when one of them brings another friend.
This is my time.
Right. But this is a really special guest. Go ahead and give her a proper introduction, Toonch.
Yeah, this is Alycia Castillo, the amazing Alycia Castillo. She works at the Texas Civil Rights Project. She's worked at the Texas Center for Justice and Equity. She is the powerhouse advocate in the state of Texas when it comes to youth injustice. So we're really excited to have you here, but also like talking about something really, really painful and difficult tonight. So it's kind of like this bittersweet moment to have you here on the Recyard with us, but really heavy topic this evening.
It is a heavy topic. We are talking about the recently published report by the Department of Justice. The report was on an investigation that they did over the Texas Juvenile Justice Department, or just the youth prisons in Texas. The report, the findings were shocking, and this is probably a good time to do a trigger warning. This is going to be a heavier topic. I know that sometimes we're at rec and we're talking about some of the more lighthearted and more fun things that happen in women's prisons, but this is a topic that it needs to be talked about, and it needs to be discussed, and we are wondering why it's not getting more attention. So tonight, because it's a heavier topic, we are just going to dive right into it. It's not our normal routine where you usually are hearing me and the Toonch going back and forth, bantering and talking about our week, because we want to take up this full time addressing this issue and talking about what we need to do about it. Right, Toonch?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can talk about issues, but we need to be able to discuss solutions and what the call of action is. So I'll let Alycia take her drink, because I'm really good at asking people to start talking right when they take a drink or a bite of something. But Alycia, I think to get us started, just can you tell us a little bit of the history of TJJD, and then the history of where this report came from?
Sure. Well, thank you all so much for having me. It is truly an honor to be on the famous On the Recyard. Really, really delighted to spend the evening with you, and sad that it has to be on this topic. But so this report came about finally after about 4 years of investigation from the U.S. Department of Justice. So it's the federal arm of law enforcement, and they have the authority to do investigations on, anything that might warrant a justice investigation. And so our friends at Texas Appleseed and Disability Rights Texas, shout out to them. They, we, over the years and working in juvenile justice reform, we just hear stories that are hard to substantiate, but like they're stories and reports of abuse in the facilities. And they took it upon themselves to file a complaint to the DOJ with some of those reports that we'd heard. And so DOJ doesn't always do it. They have not a lot of capacity to do investigations, but fortunately they agreed to do an investigation. And so over the past 4 years, and maybe some of you here watching have been some of the people who sent in leads to the DOJ, but they've been following up on all those leads and doing interviews and talking to kids and visiting all the facilities and studying every little aspect of the way the system operates, and they found some pretty horrific results. All the things that I think anyone who's been incarcerated and anyone who knows or loves anyone who's been incarcerated expect and are not really surprised by, but are still really hard to read on paper, and especially when it is revealed that it's a pattern in practice, which means that it is so common in the facilities, and this was throughout the entire system. It wasn't one isolated facility, but that it's so common that they can label it a pattern in practice. And we could get into what some of those things are later, but that's kind of how the report came about, and thank goodness it did. We've really needed a bigger push to kind of illuminate the fact for lawmakers, not just in Texas, but federally, that this is serious and this is urgent and it's a crisis. So I'm glad that came about, especially because I wanted to show you all, and please excuse my little juveniles in the background that you hear. The sweet little guys getting a bath right now, hanging out with their dad. But I wanted to share this book by our friend, Dr. William Bush. He really chronicled the entire history of the Texas Juvenile Justice Department in this book, Who Gets a Childhood? And so you can see that from its inception in 1886, 1887, a little debatable what year it really was, but there have been complaints since the very beginning. And we could share more about that later. But it's the same story, different year, different century.
Yeah, and that's the truth of the matter, right? And it's something that we continue to hammer away at, is that this is nothing new. This is what makes it even more infuriating for me as a kid that was once in that system, is that these abuses that we see in this DOJ report have consistently happened and been reported since the inception for over 100 years. And TJJD gets mad, has gotten really upset before, Alycia, when you've said that in meetings. Oh, this is a new day. We need to focus on what we're doing right now. And I remember that was said to us in a meeting when this investigation first happened. And I feel like the agency is going to say, well, but things are so much better since this report was being done. Well, you told us that when the report was happening, right? You said to trust us that these things are not going on, and they were happening right then. So a deep history of abuse and neglect in our Texas youth prison system.
Toonchi, I want to talk about the number of youth that we're talking about. What ages are we talking about? For those of you that are just joining in, we're talking about the recent investigation by the United States Department of Justice on Texas youth prisons, and some of the horrifying things that came from that report. So how many kids are we talking about that are incarcerated in TJJD in Texas, right?
Yeah, so we have today, and this number has changed a lot over the years, but today there are about 740 children incarcerated at the state level in those state secure facilities, prisons, in other words. But one thing I'll note is that while we're super grateful for this report, and it did a great job of, highlighting that this is a pervasive issue throughout the entire agency, it did not investigate any of the local county detention facilities. So words are different in the juvenile system than they are in the adult system, right? And so think of it as prisons and jails. So on the jail level, none of the jails were investigated, but we can assume that many of the same patterns and practices, because it's the same agency that heads it all, are occurring on the local level too. So there are about 37 local facilities and counties that are trying to expand right now. And at the same time, the state is trying to expand. TJJD was allocated $200 million to build 2 new facilities. Last legislative session, they were given that money, and they're currently working on designing phases for that construction plan. And so one hope is that this report will help, put a pause on that plan. But going back to your question about who these kids are, they are kids. I want everyone to know that we're not being dramatic when we say that. They are kids as young as 10 years old can be incarcerated in Texas. And while, then that's shocking and horrible to imagine a child who might still sleep with a teddy bear, or a child who can't fit in handcuffs, because their wrists are so small, they'll slip out. Those are the kids that we're we do incarcerate, and we are allowed to incarcerate in Texas. And then TJJD, so the juvenile system applies only up to 16-year-olds. So like, while the system is so bad and there are so many issues that we need to address, at the same time, 17-year-olds are excluded from the few benefits that there are in being adjudicated in the juvenile system rather than the adult system. So 17 and up go to TDCJ, unfortunately. I will say the small caveat is that some kids can be kept a little longer at certain facilities at TJAD if they're serving out a certain sentence. But I think no one over 19 is in any of those facilities at any given time. But there are children younger who can go to TDCJ, right? Which you all know, they can be certified as adults to spend time in TDCJ. And so we can talk more about that adult certification later, but couple other demographics they can touch on. We know that over 80% of the kids are kids of color, Black and Latinx youth. White kids are vastly underrepresented in these facilities. So we know that there's racism pervasive in the system, just like there is in the adult system. It's majority boys, but the girls that are there are the most vulnerable, the most victimized girls that you can imagine in the state of Texas. We know that 91% of the girls have been marked as clear or possible concern for commercial sexual exploitation. There's an assessment tool that TJAD uses to determine that, and 91% of them are marked as clear or possible concern. Everyone has mental health issues, but I think it's something like 70% of them have severe mental health needs, which means the level of care that they require, medical, psychiatric, behavioral, is just on a much higher level than a child with other serious mental health needs, right? So it's not, when I say these are the most vulnerable kids in Texas, I mean it. We have a lot of systems in place that are supposed to be catching kids like before it gets to this point, but every single one of those systems has their own gaps. And as we get further and further down in that sort of like system of gaps, the very last stop is here. And so as those kids have been victimized their whole lives and then become re-victimized and more victimized in TJAD, then we expect them to come out and be okay, and they're not, and then hence the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. So it's a big cycle that it's time for us to stop it.
Yeah, and I want to also mention too that like when we talk about kids with mental health, we and or having disabilities, the disproportionality that we see with kids with disabilities, and again in the adult system with adults with disabilities, but a large number of these kids have mental health and also a disability, which is a huge part of the DOJ report.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, on average, a child in TJAD is 5 to 7 grades behind their peers, which often indicates, an intellectual disability. A lot of children incarcerated are marked as having at some point been part of a special education program. And you're right, this was a huge part of the report, is that there are federal standards for kids who have intellectual disabilities. There's a federal act, the IDEA Act, that's supposed to make sure that there are accommodations in place for every child with a disability. And they're supposed to have IEPs, individualized education plans. And those aren't happening the way they're supposed to in TJJD, which, is especially serious and a grave concern for kids with special education needs. But also note that for every kid in TJJD, that means they're not getting the education services that they are due because they live in America and have constitutional rights. So, yeah.
When the Department of Justice was implementing this investigation, they went through a number of things, right? And one of the things that you're talking about is the education curriculum. So if we have an 11-year-old with a learning disability starting the 6th or 5th grade, even, because that's who we're talking about, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th graders, y'all, we're talking about kids. Then if they're in a public school setting, they're going to go into a special class. They're going to get their needs met so that they have the opportunity to still learn and grow. And that report showed that that's not happening in TJJD, in the Texas Juvenile Justice Department. I wanted to also point out that the report shows that body cameras were investigated, cameras within the facility, staff was interviewed, children were interviewed, disciplinary cases, all that paperwork was sorted through. This wasn't some, hey, we dropped in and we saw a few things we didn't like. This was a very extensive investigation, and they took their time with it. You said 4 years they took to investigate. I also wanted to say again, we're talking about hundreds of kids in TJJD in the prison part, but each county, I know Dallas County has its own kids prison, kids detention center. However the right terminology is for that, and it's under some scrutiny right now as well. The reports that we get from families and people that have aged out of the juvenile prison system are saying this is happening in detention centers across the state. And I think that I'm guilty of not thinking about it because it hurts. It's hard to know that this is happening to kiddos. And so what do we say to people how do we encourage people to look at this? Look at this. We need to hold ourselves accountable for letting this happen. And how do we hold the state accountable for letting this happen?
Well, I bet Toonchi has a good answer ready for that one. Do you want to go ahead?
Well, I mean, Marci, it's first and foremost like, doing our due diligence to get reports like this in the hands of media, into a broader audience, right? Because people don't know. And it always feels like, I don't know, Alycia, if you agree, but it feels like when we work in the JJ world, in the juvenile justice sphere, we feel very siloed. I feel very, when I'm in that work mode and I'm working in that area, I feel very siloed from the rest of the criminal justice advocates. And I find it so bizarre because most of us as adults spent time in that system. And I think for myself, it's been, the same way you're saying it's hard for me to look at it, as Marci, I wasn't in that system, but, it's still hard for me to look at. I don't want to see it. It's even harder for those of us that were in it. Like, it took me a while to get here because it is that painful, to be able to remember and talk about and advocate for it. It takes so much more out of me, just because of how unique that abuse and neglect affected me, right? So I think some of it is, like you're saying, this, this desire not to see it or remember it from both sides, people that are impacted and people that have never been through that, But, my work at Texas After Violence Project has taught me a lot about what liberatory memory work is. And I see what's happening here. There is this, what Hannah talked with me about, this amnesia, this willful amnesia. How else is this continuing to happen when it's clearly been documented for 100 years? It is this willful, amnesia to not remember this, right? And that's a part of abolition work, is memory. And to be able to confront those memories and to be able to hold on to them, and hold space for those memories with people in power, and hold them accountable to looking at it. I think, that's the struggle. But I think the reason too also, and I've said this a lot, it's because of the kids we're talking about who this is happening to. Kids of color and kids with mental health and disabilities. And I don't think anybody in power really wants to talk about what the issue is. And the issue is that it's happening to these children. And until we confront that, then we'll be able to work on solutions that really work, right? Because if it was other kids, right, if it was wealthy white children, I'm just going to say it, we'd have them children out of there immediately, right? If it was kids in their homes with their parents, you would have those children out of those homes. But why is it with this group of children, it's continued for 100 years? And I think it's asking the harder questions of people in power that we need to be asking.
No, I think that's such an excellent point, Toonchi, and I just wonder if this might be a good time to play Nyala's clip. For those of you who may not have been on Rec Yard time or Rec Night with my daughter from prison, Nyala, she was a victim of the Texas youth prisons. I met her in prison, and her story in length is powerful, and I'm excited to watch her as she's learning to share her story and do some of that memory work that you talked about, Toonch, because I believe that when she really grows into that, she'll be able to use that to make some real movement. So this is just part of a conversation her and I, sometimes how people who have been traumatized by the state prison system do. We casually talk about it like it's nothing. And this was one of those conversations. And I said, Nyala, I need to record this because you're saying some real stuff here that people need to know. And this is just a small clip of that. If this works, guys.
Okay.
I remember when they used to put shackles on us, they'll put the handcuffs on, but they'll put one shackle on your ankle and they'll wrap it around your handcuffs and then put the other shackle on your other ankle. So you sitting there hog tied for hours. It don't matter whenever they feel like they want to take you out.
Your hands and your feet are all tied all together.
Yep, you got handcuffs on. They put one shackle on one ankle, they wrap it around the handcuffs, then they put it on the other ankle, and you sitting there hog tied like that.
How old were you when they were doing that?
12 and 13.
12 and 13 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And where were you incarcerated?
Hunt County Juvenile Justice Center.
Oh my gosh!
Yep, in Greenville, Texas. That's how they say that's how they make the kids calm down.
It's by hog tying them.
You sit there hog tied for hours.
What do you think would happen if a parent today hog tied their child like that?
Oh, they going to prison.
It's against the law.
Yeah, that's against the law. But you see, they get away with that if you behind bars.
That last sentence, she said, but they can get away with that if you're behind bars. And I know Toonch and I, as previously incarcerated people, we know that to be very factual. I don't have experience in the youth facilities, but certainly in the adult facilities, laws that get broken and crimes against humanity that happen in there, they get away with it because you're behind bars and somehow your life is less valued. If you've done something to put yourself in that position. I want to say that Nyala was in mental health crisis when she first got locked up at 10 years old, and in mental health crisis threw a shoe at an officer, and that was her charge that she ended up. And we're talking about a 10-year-old child throwing a shoe. That's what kind of things you can go to prison for in this state. And so I just wanted to point out it can be very minor things. And she was in mental health crisis because of trauma she had experienced as an even younger child. And so I wanted to play that clip, and there's lots more to her story than that. And that was a more minor detail of some of the things that she's told me she's experienced in that place, right? And I want to go into, because she's talking about being tied up, and one of the things in the report talked about long-term solitary confinement, or being left alone long term, and what that looks like and how that's overused. It talked about many things. Excessive force, I want to talk about that too. But can we talk about the long-term isolation, I think is how it's worded in the report.
Yeah, so there there are so many different terms, as you all know, that different carceral systems use for solitary confinement, but it's solitary confinement. And so they talked about kids who, this was actually one of the pieces that surprised me, because I've heard of worse in county facilities, but on the state level, they said that there were some kids who had been there for 13 days, 14 days, just stuck in their cells with, you know, it's been a while since the agency has had to go on like full lockdown where the children aren't even let out to the restrooms. But this is a similar scenario where it'll be 23 and a half hours a day, like total, that they end up spending in their rooms, which would drive anyone, it would make anyone have mental health issues, even though they didn't in the past. And so when you're talking about a child who's already struggling with their mental health and then locking them in a room alone, and if they express any ideation of self-harm or suicide, or act out because of those things in any way, to even if it's just to get some human contact, they get punished more. And that's one thing that's really hard. I know they talked about the story of, I think it was Maddie in the report that they referenced. And this is really a story of the excessive use of force, but she had been struggling after, I think, a term of prolonged isolation, with suicidal ideation, and she told that to her guards, and sounds like they kind of made fun of her for it and told her to take off her clothes, because now, you're not allowed to have your clothes, you're not allowed to have your bed sheet, anything that could potentially be used to hurt yourself. And they give you instead that smock, right? And so she refused to take off her clothes for these guards. And then this was one of the things that they caught on body cam. But and again, like, trigger warning for anyone who's experienced any sort of carceral violence or police violence or anything like that. But the guards are heard talking to each other saying, "Do you feel threatened? I feel threatened. I think we need, we need to use force." They're making up the story for the body cam. And then they pull out what's called like an MK9 canister of pepper spray, which is generally used by law enforcement for crowd control, like during protests. It is an extremely dangerous, strong, powerful weapon that, and even in terms of canisters of pepper spray, an extremely strong form of pepper spray that they proceeded to spray directly in her face before engaging her verbally in any way after she expressed suicidal ideation. So she was punished in this way. But just story upon story like that, it's really, it's unbelievable. And one thing, Toonchi, I thought you were getting to this earlier, but I mean, sometimes when we're talking about these things or sharing specific stories, like, it's difficult for a number of reasons, but one of them is that you feel alarmist. I mean, it's very difficult to figure out how to express how bad things are and then have and appear credible. Like, people hear these stories and they're like, "There's no way," or
There's
like,
no way.
Right. Right? Like, and so they dismiss it. But it's just because it is so hard for us to imagine that this could be happening, and we're all responsible. We are the adults in this society. We pay taxes. We elect these people who allow this to happen, and that is really hard to reckon with. But it's something that collectively we're responsible for doing, because we are adults and these are children, and it's our responsibility to keep them safe.
That M9 can of pepper spray, I think that what they normally use on a one person on an incident would be a 3 or a 4, so we're talking about a 9. Toonchi, have you ever been sprayed? Have you ever personally been sprayed with pepper spray? I know you did your time a little differently than me.
Right. Well, I mean, I know the difference between the individual spray, if they spray someone individually with the small, that they have their little, that's on their tool belt thing. But that big gun, that big canister that Alicia's talking about, they sprayed the chow hall with. Um,
Mhm.
and it was tough, and it's a big room, and that's how powerful that canister is, and to imagine that sprayed directly onto a child, it is what Alicia's saying, right? Like, I do feel that way sometimes when we tell people this stuff is happening. There is this, they're either so desensitized, um, me personally, because of I think it's how they feel about the children that are there, um, but or it's that they just don't believe it. I remember a legislator when we were talking about the heat and solitary confinement during a hearing last session, and Marci, you remember, she said, "There's no way that somebody's going to add seg for putting a towel over their window." And we're like, "Yes, right." That sounds silly and dumb, but like the extremity that the state takes, um, you know, with incarcerated people, it is shocking. It's like there's no way that could be true, and I don't know what else. I am so frustrated with this. I'm so brokenhearted. I feel so betrayed. Alycia, and I think I had told you that, like, trying to make good, decent working relationships with people at the state agency after what you did to me as a kid. And I gave you an ounce of fucking trust. And then this report comes out, and I feel betrayed and lied to and gaslit all over again. And I just don't, what in the world is it going to take if y'all don't care about what's in this report? I don't know what else I don't know what else to do.
I did put the link to the report. Again, you need to be mentally prepared before you look at that document. I have had to look at it, and probably the two of you as well, in pieces. I couldn't take it all in at once, and especially I think that if you've been incarcerated as a youth, especially, and I know Toonchi, you have that experience, and I think my aunt's on also, and she said that she thinks we don't want to believe it because we can't see ourselves doing it to someone, let alone a child. And I think that's part of it as well, this disbelief when it's a story or a few stories. Oh, it must be exaggeration, it must be a one-time occurrence, but this report is showing a pattern of this. It's a pattern of neglect, a pattern of excessive force, a pattern of not meeting the needs of children with disabilities, a pattern of overuse of solitary confinement, and it's happening right now. We're on this live, and we're on the rec yard talking about it, and there are 700 plus kids right now living it in the state of Texas.
Yeah. Well, and two, the other part of this, and thinking about it, through the lens of being a teenage girl, in that facility, and sexual abuse is happening to all the children. But just thinking about that number that Alycia gave us, that's in the report, 91% of those girls have some type of something in their history that indicates that they have experienced sexual trauma prior, to being in this facility, right? And it's like you go as a kid in crisis, and you leave that crisis, and then you go into a place where it is just, you are just preyed upon, and to see that none of that is any different than it was when I was a teenager 30 years ago is just, I do appreciate that we had a caller that was me and Alycia and another advocate were on a call, and a woman called in and she goes, I am furious. I am so angry. But, Alicia's right. We can talk to these agencies. We can go to board meetings. We can, go to do legislation like Finish the Five to close those facilities. But we need to get the people in office that will do it, who have the political will and the morals to do it. And that means voting, right? It all works together. And I don't think we're going to be able to do a lot of the stuff that we want to do to rectify this until we have the right people in office.
I want to talk about what that looks like, and also the movement. I saw Sean and Sade Wright of the Right Cause Urban Youth Conservation was on, and they hashtagged Finish the Five. So I definitely want to get to that movement and what that looks like. Before we do that, we talked about, Toonchi talked about the sexual violence, the sexual assault that's happening in these youth prisons, and I'm just, as an adult, from an adult's perspective, doing time in Texas, do you remember how we would know those certain officers that we instinctively and then collectively knew to protect one another from, to stay away from, to try not to be alone from? And this is as grown people. And I'm just can't help but think that I didn't have that same instinct when I was 13 years old, when I was 15 years old, to know what a predator might look like. And then I also wanted to point out that we are talking about a lot of cell block style housing, and we know that creates more opportunity. We know in adult facilities that is more likely where those kind of incidences take place. And that's how these kiddos are being housed. And then I want to get to the body cameras, because TDCJ is rolling out their body camera footage. They're on social media, really proud of the body cameras, and I'm for it. I'm for the body cameras. I really am. I realize that's, it's going to mess up some folks' hustle in there, but I think for accountability, that's great. But this report said something about the body cameras. Do you remember, Alycia, what that report said about the use of body cameras?
This one, yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot there, and I mean, I think it's, on one hand, it feels like self-protective when we're like not leading with some of the stuff that was here, because this is maybe the worst of it. I mean, it's hard to like compare trauma and tragedies, but I think there's something particularly heinous about the idea of the sexual abuse that's happening to kids who are incarcerated, who are literally locked up and they can't protect themselves in any way. And I mean, already kids can't, right? But to imagine locking them up and then subjecting to that is just really some of the hardest stuff to think about or imagine is actually happening. But fortunately, I guess the report shares what some of that is that they caught on body camera footage. And one of the quotes I know that stood out, can we do another trigger warning if this is like someone who has experienced sexual violence in their lives in any form? Really hard stuff to hear or read, but I think it's important because a lot of like this most shocking stuff is what the media needs to be putting out for the people who aren't so impacted by these things directly, right? So the people who are in places of privilege and have power, who maybe have not had to survive all these things, can do the right thing, and they have to know what's happening. So one of the quotes that they pulled out in the report was that a guard telling a child that you're going to give it to him or he's going to take it. Knock the inwards out and wake up with a blank in your blank, indicating that if a child didn't just concede to the abuse, that it was going to happen to them anyway. But with, so really horrific. I'm grateful that the body worn camera footage caught that, but just the same way as it is with police on the street, they can turn them off. They're not supposed to. but the sheer amount of man hours that it would take to actually audit like every single minute of body cam footage is just not possible. It's not something we have the technology or manpower to do. And so we know, you basically the audits that currently happen, it's like maybe like you'll happen upon the couple of minutes that something terrible happens, but like it's a 24/7 that these children live here and are subjected to this type of violence. And so it's like, thank goodness they caught that, but how much more did they not?
Right,
Well,
that's what I was thinking. They caught several things on body cameras, and so that indicates that that's probably just a percentage. Please go ahead, Toonch. Please excuse me.
I mean, no, it kind of makes me think of like, well, I mean, it's not much of a deterrent then. Like, they're so bold in that culture, they don't even give a damn they're wearing a camera, right? Like, you have over 100 years that has allowed this. Well, hell, I'll do it on camera, and maybe somebody will catch it and do something about it. But the fact that they have that these staff member had the audacity to do this while wearing a body camera and not even turning it off. Well, I mean, Jesus Christ, like that's a boldness that I remember not even seeing TDCJ adult prison guards have, right? Like, and so it 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 just goes back to all of us that have been in that system, whether it was 30 years ago, 5 years ago, 50 years ago. It is the culture of that system that allows this to happen. We cannot trust them to reform themselves, period. They're not going to. They've already shown it over and over again. They go behind us and call us liars, and then to our face say, we're on the same page. Oh, we care for the children. You mean to tell me you care about these kids and this is what's still going on and you won't even own it? You won't even have any accountability to it. Oh, it was, oh, this and oh, but look what, no accountability. And we're supposed to trust you to build 2 other facilities? Give me a fucking break. It makes me so angry to know that people are abusing children with their body camera turned on and just like, I don't give a damn, didn't even bother to turn it off.
And just like Niala said, if this was happening, I mean, I have these sweet boys that stay with me. And if something happened with these boys that has been happening inside of these facilities where children are being cared for by the state, I would be arrested. I would be in handcuffs. I would be back in prison. It's illegal crimes, not only against humanity, but against the very law are happening to those kids. And so what do we do? What do we do? The report's out. The report's out. The proof is out. The Department of Justice. I feel, and this is maybe naivety, or I mean, I just would think the Department of Justice found all of this. What are they doing? They just published the report. Is that the end of their play in this?
It's a good question. So they, there's a few things that can happen. So the report was released. What was that? I feel like I've lived lifetime since it was released. There's been a lot. Was that just last week?
It was just last week, Alycia. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So they get 49 days. The agency gets 49 days to agree to take the remedial steps that are outlined towards the conclusion of the report, that are recommendations that the DOJ had, which we could talk about those in a minute, but are, not it. If they choose not to comply with those changes, then the feds can sue them to comply with those changes. So we enter a lengthy litigation process, and that's a lot, and a lot of time that would pass. And so that's kind of the DOJ's part in it. Now, folks are welcome to continue to reach out to the DOJ if there are more reports from those state facilities, or even the county facilities. Feel free to send reports. They don't have an open investigation on the counties, but they probably should. And any report helps them build a case for the future. And throughout these last few years, sometimes it felt like I know Brett Murfish, one of the people who put that complaint together at Texas Appleseed, she's mentioned that it's felt like, screaming into the void sometimes, putting those complaints out there. But look, I mean, here we are, right? 4 years later, and we have this. So it's really worthwhile. I would love to put the link in the chat if I had it, but I can't think of what it is. But we can maybe add that later, the link to email the DOJ your complaint. And there's also a phone number if you prefer that, to just call and give them your complaint. And it's not very formal. They don't require you to have, all the information or anything like that. I think just any information helps them. And it's better to put it somewhere than to just, fester with it. But there's that. And that's why, there are so many different angles that we always have to take, right? So even though Texas Appleseed and Disability Rights filed this complaint, we didn't stop our advocacy, right? And just hope that the DOJ was going to do something. At the same time, we're doing direct action and activism, organizing on the local level to try to stop the new builds of new local facilities, right? And then also Jen has gone into the facilities and talked with the girls directly, and you can do more direct action. There are incredible groups in your city, most likely, that are doing great direct service work with kids that keep them from going in the first place. And then there's stuff like the state level advocacy, which is what I do for my day job, right? Is try to educate lawmakers and the public about what's going on so that we can make legal policy changes to at least have the right thing on the book that we can refer back to for the courts or anything else, later on. And also to just try to make whatever change we can. And so that's why I finished the 5 started. Jennifer said it best earlier that we cannot trust this agency to reform itself. They've been saying they're going to for over 100 years. It's the same line. Honestly, it's really baffling. You can read through this book. You can listen to a podcast called Unreformed, which is about the youth system. It's actually about one facility in Louisiana, or is it Alabama? It might be Alabama.
I think it's
but about one school, and it's so interesting. Their lawmakers said the exact same lines ours have. And they said it was this lawmaker in the 80s said the same thing, this lawmaker in the early 2000s, this lawmaker in the 60s, this lawmaker in the 20s. And it's just the same thing. And it's so wild that we keep doing this. So that's why we can't say the same thing and expect something different, because it's the definition of insanity. So we have to shut it down. And one of the things that also convinces me of that is that we did have some big measures that took place in the early 2000s to try to make wholesale change of the agency, and those didn't work either. What happened was we ended up changing the name from TYC to TJJD, and that's it. And we've shut down some facilities, thank goodness. That's been a long road. There used to be 14, now we just have these 5 left. And so it's my belief, and hopefully y'all's too, that we can finish the 5. We can continue this arc of decarcerating kids, stop criminalizing kids, and then once and for all just shut the facilities down, and make sure that instead of thinking about, spending all this time, how are we going to fix these facilities? What will new facilities look like? How could we make them friendlier? Then we can spend that precious time and money, let's be honest, on developing an infrastructure that is of support and of care on a local level that is uniquely designed for local communities, because Dallas does not look the same as even Hunt County where Neala went, right? Even though they're very close, there's a very different community, and you have to develop interventions and mitigation efforts that fit that community. Just like every person deserves individualized care and support and attention, so do all these counties to create what they need. And some of that can be school-based, some of that can be through our local mental health authorities, some of that might need to be, we can get creative, right? But I think that's another barrier for us, is folks have that failure of imagination of what could we have instead? But I think because this is happening and this is a crisis and it's so urgent, we don't have the luxury of sitting around and thinking of what's the most cost-effective way we could do something, or maybe let's build this while we build the new facilities, which is something that's proposed a lot, right? And I'll know one last thing and then I'll stop ranting, but that's that these new facilities that are supposed to be mental health focused and really friendly and a better built environment, those are not expected to even break ground until 2028. So we're talking about, what about even if that were to go through, which God forbid, but like we're doing nothing in the meantime to stop the flow of kids into the system. So that's why it's really urgent to not only shut down the facilities, but make a plan to shut them down, make a plan for the money that's currently going towards maintaining those, go to local communities so that people in rural areas where these facilities are located can have jobs that they want to have, like jobs that actually help children rather than harm children. And then also we need to make those policy changes that will decriminalize kids altogether, right? No child should be in a prison because they smoked a vape pen, and so they are. So yeah, those are the very, not very succinct, but those are the 3 steps: shut them down, invest in something new, and decriminalize children.
Toonchi, we have somebody watching or listening right this second that is saying, if we shut down youth prisons in Texas, there are kids that deserve to be in prison, or there are kids that need to be in prison. So what happens if a child is in a situation that they commit a crime and are a danger at that time to themselves or to others? What do we do with these kiddos if there are no prisons?
Oh, it's the question. It's the golden question we get every single time. And remember, those kids are the few, right? They're the few. But I will say this, right? And me and Alycia have had this conversation a lot too, is that I was one of those kids. I was in deep, serious mental health crisis. I had plans to hurt someone else. I had plans to hurt myself. But when we talk about safe, secure settings, that does not have to be carceral prison settings. Now, like Alycia mentioned, can we not be more creative and more thoughtful and more intentional in the humane, healing, restorative ways to keep a child that's in crisis safe? Right? That's it. And to say that a child deserves incarceration and deserves to be in a cage, I don't know what child does, right? Because every violent behavior that any child has ever presented, including myself, was always a need that was not met. And so, just like the kids in isolation, we're going to escalate until somebody hears us, and that includes violent behavior. But if a need is met, the violent behavior starts to go away, right? So I think it's trying to transform our minds into imagining, to reimagine what truly justice and rehabilitation and care and community looks like. Nobody's saying that, well, if children are in closer to home, right, they're in their counties getting the care they need, that means that they're in crisis and they can go home or be a danger to themselves or someone else. And that is not what prison abolition work is. That's not what Finish the Five is about. It's making sure that children in crisis have the care they need in the most humane, least restrictive way possible. That's the only way I healed, right? And I tell people, after 20 years in this system, starting as a kid, right? That the shit that happened to me there, compounded with my mental health that stumbled me into the system to begin with, that is exactly what sent me on that trajectory through the adult prison system for the next 18 years. And the only thing that stabilized me was outside of those cages with real community care that truly treated my mental health disorder. And within 5 years, I'm able to sit here and be stable and do the amazing work that we're all doing, right? In 5 years, that was accomplished, 18 years of this kind of punitive, harmful, damaging system did to me in just 4 or 5 years, right? So, yeah, safe settings do not mean the abuse in the prison cells and the horrid conditions that they're living in. And I think that needs to be clear.
There are folks watching right now that had maybe a different experience, and it's similar to like when I'm talking about prison. Sometimes somebody will be like, "Oh, it wasn't that bad," or "It was okay," and maybe they did less time, or maybe their experience was just quite different. And I want to point out that we're not just talking about Toonchi's experience. We're not just talking about Nyala's experience. We're talking about a pattern that has been established and documented now, proven by the U.S. Department of Justice in this report. I put the report in the chat. If you're watching from Facebook or YouTube, again, take it in stride. Open it when you are mentally prepared to handle that, because it's really shocking, some of the things that are happening and have been happening, and that match reports that we hear from our Linus members that have experience in that facility, and from families of kiddos that are in there now. So if you had an experience that's different, thank goodness for it, for you, right? And thank goodness for that. But this report is showing very blatantly some horrific things that are happening now. How can people get involved with Finish the Five?
There are a few ways. So Jennifer is a great resource and one of the people who birthed the idea into existence and our first policy brief and the campaign generally. And so there's, one of the key experts in the state, is right here. But we're working on a website. We all do a lot of stuff, and website has just not gotten up yet, but you can find information about us on several websites. So Austin Liberation Youth Movement is an incredible all youth led advocacy group, activist group that does advocacy on a lot of different issues, but Finish the Five is the main issue. So if you go to Austin Liberation, I want to say .org/finish the five. Oh my gosh, that could be so wrong. Then you can find a whole page on it there. You can also go to texascivilrights.org, and I think it's txcivilrights.org/finish the five, the number five, and you can learn more there. Click to join, sign up for our emails, join the coalition that way. We host, whole meetings with everybody. And then we also have work groups where we get down to the nitty gritty and work on the policy, work on the direct actions and the outreach that we need to keep this movement growing. Because the next legislative session is coming up soon. It begins in January 2025. And that's where a lot of decisions are going to be made. I think following this report coming out, as much as the general public can ignore it and the media wants to ignore it, lawmakers will make sure that they don't, and that they're not able to. And so they'll have to make some decisions, and we'll be up there to try to help prevent those from being more harmful and to even see if maybe we can get some good done too.
I put the link to the press release that I think that you authored, and it has quotes from a group numerous advocates here in Texas, and so you all can check that out. And I want to, first of all, Toonchi, if you have, perfect, thank you. I looked for that, and I'll add that in the chat too. Toonchi, I want to give you the opportunity for final thoughts, but I also was wondering if you had wanted to answer this question that we're getting from YouTube. and you described yourself as a youth that was needed to be separated at that moment, needed to be protected. And what does that look like? What would that have looked like for you personally, for your situation personally, for community care?
If they would have kept me in my home, in my area, my dad could have seen me every weekend at least, right? I was in a facility out in West Texas, took 8 hours for him to get to one way. I was isolated out there, and then of course we know what happens in this type of culture when there's no accountability or oversight. But if I had been able to stay in my area, right, like Williamson County, if in Williamson County is one of those places that I feel like isn't going in the right direction, been able to receive the actual mental health treatment for my mental health disorder, right? If I would have received that in that person-centered, strength-based way that I did when I got home, right? Like all of my symptoms would have been under control, right? Like I would have gotten better, right? In a short, I feel like it would have been in a decent amount of time. Like it doesn't take long once you get the right treatment. And I feel like I would have stabilized, and I think that I would eventually been able to return to my family, and I would have had, my whole life would have been different. My whole life would have been, I wouldn't have gone through another 18 years of the adult prison system, right? Because I would have been able to heal and heal immediately.
Thank you for that, Toonchi, and Alycia Castillo with the Texas Civil Rights Project and a power advocate here in Texas. Absolutely one of our favorite people and a shero for certain. Thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you for offering your insight and your evaluation of this report. Thank you for our to-do list, because we are going to look at this. We're going to look at the press release. We're going to look at the Finish the Five movement. We are going to share this information because I think that a lot of people just don't know. And because this is not getting a whole lot of media, I personally will try to do a push for that. And everyone watching, that's what we can do, is we can ask, like, you can email your local news station and they ask for tips, and you can ask them, hey, have y'all seen this report? What about this report? And that's another way that we can bring momentum to this and shine a light on what's happening to these kiddos. Toonchi, anything else?
No, I love our community here every Wednesday night, and I know that they are advocates themselves. And trust me, it's been several times we've talked about something on this podcast, and when the next 2 days we hear from the unit or one of the prison units where something happened, suddenly it's been taken care of, or it's just a sudden drastic change in something. And I feel like our community here steps up and makes phone calls and emails to their legislators, to prison officials. So hopefully y'all have your marching orders tonight, and just, we're so proud of each one of you. And again, Alycia being one of my favorite human beings in the whole world. Thank you for hanging out with us tonight and taking time out from your little ones too. We appreciate you immensely.
Thank you so much.
Big shout out. Big shout out to Alicia's husband, who's taking care of the little fellas tonight. And again, yes, this is our favorite night of the week, hanging out on the rec yard. This was a heavier topic, so I encourage you to take a deep breath, step outside, do a stretch, do a little bit of meditation, or whatever you do to ground yourself and center yourself. Take care of yourself so that we can then get into action. And what can we do to protect these kiddos that are in harm's way right now? And we will be back next week, the same time, same place, live on the rec yard, Wednesday night, 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. Y'all, thanks for liking the live. Thanks for sharing the live. Thanks for being in the chat. We appreciate you so much. And if you're listening anywhere where you hear your favorite podcast, leave us a review. And that helps this topic and other topics get spread to an even wider audience. Until next time. Yes, please, Alycia, go for it.
Sorry, I just wanted to leave one last word for anyone who's still watching, and that's, some of you have shared in the comments, that you experienced all these things in TJJD, and I just want it to be said that you didn't deserve what happened to you. You were a child, and you deserved to be protected, and it doesn't matter what you did. I don't care. You were a child, and you deserve to be protected no matter what you did. And some of you, it's point blank, period. You didn't deserve what happened to you, and I'm so sorry that it happened to you, and I'm grateful that you still are here and that you made it. You're a survivor, and that we're in the fight together now. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thank you, Alycia.
Thank you, Alycia, for that. We appreciate you so much, and Toonchi and I definitely support that and ditto that all the way. We will see you all next week.
Out with us on the Recyard Women's Prison Podcast with Marci Marie